Alrighty, well, welcome everyone. We're so happy to have you here today in person, and we welcome all our guests online. We are going to go ahead and get started. Before I introduce our speaker, I want to share with you some information about fall prevention. September is Fall Prevention Awareness Month, so let me tell you a little bit about it, and then our speaker. So my name is Erica Thompson, and I am part of the Salt Lake County Aging and Adult Services Health Promotion Program. We're so glad that you have come to join us today. Today, the event is sponsored by the Fall Prevention Awareness Month. Before we proceed, we're going to go ahead and tell you something about a short message about fall prevention. So the CDC reports that the leading cause of injury-related deaths among adults 65 and older is due to fall. And 1 out of every 5 falls result in serious injury, such as a broken bone or a head injury. However, even those who are not seriously injured when they fall may experience the emotional consequences of falling. They become more wary, reduce their mobility, and cut back on everyday activities. Unfortunately, these attempts to protect themselves can actually make the problem worse. When a person is less active, they become weaker, which increases the likelihood that they will fall, and that their fall will result in a serious injury. Most falls are caused by a combination of risk factors. The more risk factors a person has, the greater the chance of falling. For those who are with us in person, we have a little, no, we don't, but we do have information over there, and I'll tell you more about it in a minute. But some of those risk factors include lower body weakness, difficulties with walking and balance, the use of medications and over-the-counter medications that affect how steady you are on your feet, malnutrition and dehydration, vision problems, foot pain, poor footwear, home hazards such as rocks, cords, clutter, or uneven steps. So in listing all these risk factors, I hope the things stood out to you. So the first one, aging. Aging is not a risk factor. Many people think that falls are normal part of aging. The truth is not. So aging is inevitable. We're all aging, but falling is not. The second one is that most of these risk factors can be managed, reduced, or eliminated with preventive actions. So now the good news is that you have a team in the Salt Lake County Aging and Adult Services ready to support and help you prevent these actions. So Aging and Adult Services provides several courses designed to increase your strength and balance, develop healthy eating and lifestyle habits, and manage pain that might be keeping you from being active and independent as you like to be. So our strength and balance workshops include enhanced fitness, arthritis foundation exercise program, Tai Chi, walk with ease, and stepping on. Our lifestyle workshops include the Aging Mastery Program, the Stepping Up Your Nutrition, living well with chronic conditions, living well with diabetes, mind over matters, healthy bowels, healthy bladder, and more. So the truth is most falls can be prevented. Don't wait until that first close one or the actual fall to begin taking these measurements for yourself. If you haven't taken one of our classes before, please consider doing so. Classes are held multiple times throughout the year in various locations, and you can find a class brochure at the table. We do have that over there. For those viewing remotely, you can find specific information for where the classes are being taught, in our website, livingwell.utah.gov. Okay, so with that said, we are so pleased to be able to have Maura Hahnenberger with us. Um, Maura Hahnenberger, PhD, is an associate professor in the Geoscience Department at the Salt Lake County Community College. Salt Lake County Community College, she teaches and advises in atmospheric science and geographic programs in both face and online settings. Her research focused on dust storm in the western United States, including where the dust comes from, what weather systems make it move, and its impact on the air quality. She received her bachelor's in science and master's in science in meteorology and PhD in atmospheric science from the University of Utah. At home, Maura has a husband, a 5-year-old son, 2 dogs, 1 cat, 9 chickens, and an unknown number of fish, and a big garden.
Background about what's happening to the lake and why it is important, why the lake is really important. And we'll talk about a bunch of different things about the Great Salt Lake, but a bunch of the talk is going to be about dust because that is my expertise, dust storms. And so we have on this first slide here, this is a picture one of my colleagues took of a dust storm coming off of the bed of the Great Salt Lake. And we'll talk about why we should care about this dust here. But first, before we get into dust, I want to talk a little bit. Let's see if I can move this up. There we go. Perfect. I want to talk a little bit about what is happening to the Great Salt Lake. And so this is from a paper me and my colleagues published a few years ago, looking about what is really driving the changes that we have seen in the Great Salt Lake. Goes back to about 1840 to about 2020. And then the y-axis is our mean elevation of the Great Salt Lake. And so we have 2 lines. We have the red line, which is the actual Great Salt Lake level that has been observed. And this is from an observation station in Gilbert Bay. And then the blue line is what we call the natural level of the lake. And so what me and my colleagues did to create that top line is we looked at all of the water that we are kind of taking out of the watershed of the Great Salt Lake system and not letting it go to the Great Salt Lake. And so we take all that water, figure out how much water that is, and then add it back to the lake. What we get is that blue line. And so that blue line shows that if humans had not been using water from the lake level really wouldn't have changed very much. It goes up and down through natural cycles, but it wouldn't be showing the steep decline. But with our use of water from the Great Salt Lake, the lake level is declining. And last fall, we hit a record low level of the Great Salt Lake. And this year we have broken that record and we are now again at a new record low level for the Great Salt Lake throughout our observational record. So then the question is, well, what is this consumptive use? What is this use of water that's causing this lake level to decline? Okay, so what consumes the water and makes it so this water is not going to the Great Salt Lake? The number one use of water is agriculture. And so some colleagues of mine at the Utah Division of Water Resources did some analysis and looked at, well, what is causing this decline? And so we found that agriculture is about 63% of And that's not the only thing that's consuming the water. We also have mining that is going on, mineral extraction from the lake, and that increases the surface area of evaporation, and they also use water in their processing, and so that has caused some decline. Also, cities, so municipal use is declining the lake, as well as industrial use throughout our cities. Our impounded wetlands, so these are wetlands that are water is put in order to have habitat for water birds. That also increases the surface area of the lake and changes the flows and can increase evaporation. And then reservoir evaporation for places like, let's see, what I'm trying to think of a good example of a reservoir in the basin. Willard Bay is one example of that. And there's also several other reservoirs within the Great Salt Lake Basin. So number one is agriculture, but we have a lot of other uses that are causing this decline. And I have an image on the left side of the screen here showing that change in the level of the Great Salt Lake, and we'll look at another image in a moment. The white outline is the previous high of our Great Salt Lake, when it basically, all of the shorelines were covered with water. And then this is an image from, I think, 2019, where the lake is much smaller and we have a lot of exposed areas. And some of our bays of the lake are almost entirely lacking water, including the Bear River Bay and the Farmington Bay. Another piece of data that's on this image here is how much water comes from different river systems. And the highest amount of water actually comes from the Bear River. So 58% of the water that comes into the Great Salt Lake comes from the Bear River, 15% from the Weaver, and 22% from the Jordan River, and then small amounts from some of the other smaller streams moving into it. And so a lot of that agricultural use is actually in the Bear River system with smaller amounts in those other areas. Okay, so just one more look at the changes we have seen to the Great Salt Lake. So on the left is our image from 1988, when we were at a very high elevation from the Great Salt Lake. At this time, there were concerns about flooding of areas around the edge of the lake, including Interstate 80 at the south end. And then we have our September 2021 level, where we have a much, much smaller lake. We also see differences in the color of the lake. So we see that the north half of the lake has this red color. That's due to the railroad causeway that has gone across the middle of the lake that actually separates the lake. Really, it's now two different is some bacteria that have this reddish color, which creates this red color for that north end. But we'll see later that due to that high salinity, not much else lives there. And so in terms of my research area in dust, one of the big concerns is we now have over 800 square miles of exposed shoreline around the Great Salt Lake. And so we'll see what is going on. Is that producing dust for us? Okay, so there's a lot of stuff on here. I won't talk about everything on this slide, but I want to talk a little bit about why a declining lake is a problem. So my big concern is dust, but there's a lot of other issues. So what is driving the changes to the lake? I already mentioned our consumptive use of water is the big driver for the decline. Another thing that impacts the Great Salt Lake is what's called water imports. So we actually have water that comes into the Great Salt Lake system from places like the Colorado River Basin. We have diversions that bring water over, and that actually can help buffer a little bit the decline of the Great Salt Lake, because we are able to use that water instead of the water that would be going to the lake. Also, climate variability. So we saw in that graph that the lake naturally is going to go up and down, but without human use of water, we wouldn't see that big decline. And so the variability in climate is driving the lake, as well as climate change. With climate change, we're seeing more rain and less snow in our mountains, and we're seeing warmer temperatures, which leads to more evaporation and more situations of drought. And surface evaporation from the surface of the lake. And so this changes basically how much water is in that lake. It reduces the lake level, makes the water shallower, increases the shoreline, bare shoreline around, and also increases the salinity. And that's one of the big concerns in terms of the types of ecosystems that are around the Great Salt Lake, is that increasing salinity is a big driver of that. So what are some of the impacts? I will talk a lot about windblown dust later. Other concerns are things like closures of marinas and the need to dredge those out. Most of the marinas around the Great Salt Lake are no longer usable by most watercraft. There's also concerns about changes to the mineral harvest, which is one of the big industries on the lake, as well as brine shrimp harvest. So those are the two biggest industries on the lake, minerals and brine shrimp. And both of those are being impacted by these low lake levels. In terms of our natural ecosystem, we're very concerned about waterfowl and shorebirds that use the lake. Millions of birds use the lake every year. And then we also have reductions in recreation and wetland habitat that we're looking at. And so there's a lot of different types of impacts we're seeing across the lake. And so the changes to the lake are definitely a concern. Okay, so this is a slide I borrowed from the Great Salt Lake Advisory Council. I'll provide their information later in the talk. And this is kind of their breakdown of kind of some of the big impacts. I'm not going to go through all of the stuff on this slide, but basically they break it up in that the Great Salt Lake declining is a concern for our economy. People will be losing money and have less prosperity due to the decline of the Great Salt Lake. It's a concern for our environment. It's going to change our snowpack and also increase dust in the atmosphere. And it's a concern for our ecology. 10 million birds visiting the Great Salt Lake area every year as a stopover and breeding ground. And so this is something that basically impacts all parts of our system in the Great Salt Lake watershed. So, okay, this is kind of a crazy slide. I was trying to figure out a way to kind of break this down, but I was like, I'm just going to put it up here. So this is a new thing that came out of the Great Salt Lake Advisory Council, and they're one of the organizations that are trying to understand what's happening to the Great Salt Lake and talk about what we can do to kind of make sure we're not hitting some really critical thresholds. So there's a lot of data on here, but I'm going to highlight a couple specific points. And so on the top of this graph is what's called salinity. And this is basically how salty is the water in the Great Salt Lake. And this is broken down to different locations in the Great Salt Lake, but I'm going to highlight just two. And so the two places I want to highlight are Gunnison Bay, which is the north arm, which I said is that area that's cut off by the railroad causeway and has that red color. And that is indicated on the far right side of this graph over on the right. Those are the types of salinity you're seeing. So very high salinity on the far right side. The other place I want to highlight is the upper part of the Gilbert Bay, which is also known as the south arm, the large area kind of that's blue, dark blue in the satellite images. And that upper brine layer in Gilbert Bay is kind of in this middle part of the graph here. And so the top part shows salinity, and then the bottom part in these different colors, greens, yellows, and reds, are indicating what is it kind of bad or good for different parts of our ecosystem for the Great Salt Lake, and also for things like mineral extraction as well. And so basically, if you're in the green area, you're good. If you're in the yellow area, it's kind of a concern. If you're in the red, basically those ranges of salinity are bad for whatever type of the ecosystem that is. And so if we go over to the far right part of the graph here, where the north arm is, you'll notice if you go down from the right side, there's a lot of red. Not everything is red, but a lot of stuff is red. So things like brine shrimp, live brine flies, and let's see, what else we have here? Oh, macro invertebrates, which are little kind of insects that live in the water. In the north arm, it's just too salty for all of those things. And so we have a much reduced ecosystem in that north arm because it's so salty. So that is kind of where it is, and it's probably, with the current situation, we're not gonna get back to, kind of better salinity levels there. So we focus really our efforts more on the south arm, because the south arm, we currently have a vibrant ecosystem, but what we'll see is we're on kind of a threshold. So the south arm, we're kind of in the middle right here, right now in this graph. And so what we see is that right now, quite a bit of things are in the green, that things are pretty good for things like macroinvertebrates, for brine shrimp and brine flies, and for the avian species, the birds that live in that area. But what we're seeing is that the salinity levels are increasing due to reduced water flows in the Great Salt Lake. And as we move to the right on this graph, we're hitting this point right about here, which is about 180, where are the units here? Grams per liter, 180 grams per liter of salt in the water. And when you hit that point, we hit this threshold where many of these species, we shift from green to red. And that's where we are right now, and why we're really concerned about this, that we're hitting up, we're in the 170s, and we're almost at that point where potentially we could have a collapse of this ecosystem. And in the next slide, I'll kind of give a view of what this ecosystem looks like. And that goes from the brine shrimp and bacteria at the lowest level to our birds that are a lot of concern to a lot of folks. So the big takeaway from this is for the South Arm and Gilbert Bay, right now, we're at this threshold where if we keep increasing salinity, we could get into this red area that is going to be a concern for a lot of the ecosystem. And so what does this ecosystem look like? This is a slide that kind of shows the web of this ecosystem. And I'm going to draw your attention to the bottom of the slide. So the very bottom of this slide is kind of the physical factors that are affecting this. That includes the inflows of water to the lake, the volume of the lake, how much water is in the lake, and then the temperature and salinity of the lake. And so those are the big drivers that change this whole web, this whole nutrient web here. That leads into the nutrients that are available and the conditions that are available for these. At the which is our brine shrimp and our brine flies. And so those are the next step up in our ecosystem. That feeds into some directly to our water birds, but also into our choristids, which are a little insect that live in the lake. And then that feeds at the top our water birds. And those water birds, again, this is millions of birds each year. And so it's this base of that temperature, salinity, the amount of water available, that's really the base that builds up this entire ecosystem. And if we lose any parts of this ecosystem, so it becomes too salty for these brine shrimp or too salty for these photosynthetic bacteria, that could potentially collapse the entire ecosystem. So that's one of the reasons why you should care, why should we worry about the Great Salt Lake. Okay, so now we're going to transition, so that was kind of the more ecosystem side of things. Now we're going to transition to my expertise, particularly, which is dust. And so why are we concerned about dust? So I pulled out this image. So this is an image from an area called Milford Flat. And this, I took this photo, and this is an area that was disturbed and produced literally tons of dust following 2007 wildfire. It was called the Milford Flat Fire, and it was the largest wildfire in Utah history. So they had the wildfire, which was a concern, but then after the wildfire, they went in and they disturbed the soil. Why did they disturb it? Is because they wanted to grow native plants. So this area had been covered by a lot of invasive species. So they went in and they seeded it, they tilled up the soil, they did something called chaining, or they break it up, and hoping that these native plants would grow. At that time, however, we were in a very deep drought, and basically about none of the native plants grew. When I went out there on this trip, we saw literally like two plants, like two little plants growing that were native plants. Most of it looked like this. So because none of the plants grew and you have disturbed soil, all of this dust flew, and where did it blow to? Places like Salt Lake City and the Wasatch Mountains. And so this was in the 2010s, and we had a series of very, very dusty years. At that time, however, there was a lot more water in the Great Salt Lake, and we didn't have that much dust from the Great Salt Lake. But now we have all of this exposed shoreline, and we're concerned, could this be a lesson for the Great Salt Lake? And so the big thing is, when we get to looking at what the Great Salt Lake looks like right now, we don't want the Great Salt Lake to start looking at like this. And this little plant here, what this is showing is all on the bottom part, that is the roots of the plant. And that's was about foot to 18 inches high. And so basically we lost about a foot of soil from this area due to that disturbance and being blown away as dust. And so what are the key questions about dust? So the key questions about dust, where is that dust coming from? Where does the dust go? And then what are the impacts of this dust? And I'll talk about, I have a whole team of scientists that we are working on these questions to try to understand dust. Oh, and this is a photo I took from looking over at the Great Salt Lake Desert. So not from the Great Salt Lake itself, but the area around the Great Salt Lake that also produces a lot of dust. This is just north of the Bonneville Salt Flats. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about our project. So I'm part of what's called the Dust Squared Project, which is a National Science Foundation project. And Dust Squared stands for Dust Across a Desert Urban Summit Transect. And so I'm going to introduce kind of the Harry at the University of Utah. He's focusing on these sources of dust. He has a weather station out on the bed of the Great Salt Lake, and he has taken samples of the soils of the Great Salt Lake, and we'll look at some of that data later to see what's in this dust and how likely is the dust to blow. I am focused on the dust transport, and so what types of weather systems are making the dust blow and where is it going? Dr. Greg Carling at Brigham Young University, he's focused on what's called dust geochemistry, what is in the dust, which can be a concern for our health and our ecosystems. Dr. Mackenzie Skiles at the University of Utah, she focuses on dust on snow. So when the dust falls on snow, how does that change the dark or lightness of the snow? How does that change how it melts? And how does it change the chemistry of the snow? Dr. Jeff Monroe, he's focused on how dust helps create soils in the high mountains. And Dr. Janice Varaney at Utah State University, she focuses on dust and the nutrients they provide to our mountain ecosystems. So one more kind of looking back in time, this is a painting that I found actually when I was working on my PhD, and I was trying to research about what are some of the historic accounts of dust in Utah. And I found this amazing book by Mr. Chira Obata. Mr. Chira Obata was from Japan and moved to Berkeley, California. And he was a very highly trained artist. He was teaching art in Berkeley. During World War II, he was rounded up and relocated or interned at Topaz internment camp in central Utah. It was located very close to Delta. And while he was there, he tried to continue while he was interned at Topaz. And he also wrote about some of these events. And so I'll just read one of his quotes from his book. And he writes, "The desert dust storms, barracks, rooms, everything everywhere was sunk in darkness. But not so our determination to conquer nature's violence. We looked up, and there, as if in answer, not 50 feet above us, we saw above us the blue of the sky." And so when I read this, I was really struck by kind of not the types of conditions that they were facing here at Topaz, but also the kind of hope and optimism that Mr. Chira Obata had in this really difficult position where he was being, imprisoned for basically doing nothing wrong, just for his nationality. And so what caused us to have so much dust at Topaz? Basically two main things. One is there's a dry lake bed nearby, the severe dry lake. which is dry most of the time. It occasionally has water, but that dry lake bed, and then also disturbed soils. So the construction of the topaz and tournament camp itself disturbed soils around the area that increase that. And so these dry lakes, disturbance of that soil is a big driver of dust production. So where does dust come from? And so here is a photograph of myself and my dog, my old dog Roscoe, actually out collecting dust samples on the Sevier dry lake. And so these dry lake beds are a big producer of dust. These are sometimes called flyas. Also, dry lake shorelines. So even if the lake isn't totally dry, the shorelines of these lakes, particularly the Great Salt Lake, is a concern. But there's other sources as well, including wildfire scars. I mentioned that when we talked about the Milford Flat area, mining operations, so around the salt. So focusing on the Great Salt Lake itself, which parts of the lake bed are going to produce dust? The good news. So there is some good news. The good news is a bunch of the shoreline of the Great Salt Lake has what we call crust. And when you have crust on it, these physical crusts basically are firm and hard. And when the wind blows over it, the particles of soil do not get lifted up and blown. And we have different types of crust. So I have some photos here from my colleague Kevin Perry. We have on the upper left a very thick crust. We have a moderate crust. And then we have a very shallow crust, and then there's some area with no crust. And so right now, mostly it's the areas with no crust that are producing most of the dust. However, areas with shallow crust, that shallow crust isn't very strong and is disturbed very easily. Even just wind can over time erode that shallow crust and create a new dust source. So one of the big things that we want to avoid is disturbing these crusts, because if we disturb these crusts, then we potentially have that Milford Flat situation where tons of dust are coming off here. So keeping that dust or keeping that crust is really critical. So the next question is, well, where does this dust go? And so we have two main, what we call regional transport pathways. And this is associated with a type of storm that we call an intermountain cyclone. So when an intermountain cyclone moves into our area, before the storm, we have strong southerly winds. And today, it's warm out, and you might notice it's windy. Those winds are coming from the south. And so those strong southerly winds can be a producer of dust. Today, they're not quite strong enough to be picking up a lot of dust. The air is pretty good. But as the storms approach closer, we can get this pathway. And that's what the image on the right is showing, this movement of air. And we get dust coming ahead of these storms. However, we also sometimes have dust as the storms move in. And so we have these cold fronts that move through, it shifts the winds from the northwest, and we can get dust from areas like the Great Salt Lake into the Salt Lake Valley. So these two main wind directions ahead of the storm and then while the storm's happening are the main pathways. With local dust, so if you live right next to the Great Salt Lake, really any direction of strong winds can potentially bring dust to you. So if you're close to the source, it's a lot more of a concern, because any strong winds, wherever they're coming from, potentially impact you. Okay, so this is just a little depiction I put together of this type of intermountain cyclone. So this is my depiction of a low pressure center. All the lines are indicating low pressure in the middle. And then the two blue and red lines are fronts. And the big one that concerns us is this cold front. And so when this cold front comes in, ahead of the cold front, we get winds coming from the southwest. And then as the cold front comes through, the air cools, and we have winds from the northwest. And this type of storm is the real driver of dust in Utah. Okay, so when we have this transport, where does the dust end up? And so this is some data from my colleague Jeff Monroe, who put out collectors up in the mountains to see how much dust is being deposited. So this is a measure of dust deposition. And in this, basically, the bigger the purple circle, the more dust that is being deposited. And so throughout Utah and Nevada, Idaho, basically everywhere we get dust. But what we see is that Salt Lake City, which is the big circle kind of near the middle top there, is a kind of gravel pits and other mining operations nearby. So with all of those sources, we get a lot of deposition of dust, but definitely dust happening all over our mountains throughout Utah. A big question I've been getting recently is arsenic. So arsenic has been in the news. There's arsenic in the dust from the Great Salt Lake. And so where is this coming from? So my colleague, Kevin Perry, he went out and did a big survey. So everywhere there is a red dot on this map, he biked out there. He had this fat tire bike that he used to go around the lake bed. He biked out there and took samples of the soil and then brought those back to his lab and tested the chemical composition of that dust. And so what he found, when he took those samples, he then compared the amount of different chemicals in the dust to what are called EPA standards. And these are EPA standards in many locations was arsenic. And that's what this map is showing. Basically, the bigger the circles, the higher the concentrations of arsenic in those soils. And so right now, it's still an unknown question how much arsenic people breathing the dust are potentially exposed to. That is tracked. We do track the elemental composition of the dust. But we haven't kind of made the connection about, okay, is that too much to be concerned? But it's something we're continually looking at. And so why might we be concerned about arsenic is because chronic exposure to arsenic can cause several different cancers, cardiovascular disease, and diabetes. So really, we don't want to be exposed to this dust, and we definitely don't want to be breathing in arsenic. So here's another image kind of looking at, well, what are the air quality impacts of this? So this is a case study event from February 5th, 2021. During this event, the image on the upper left is a satellite image. The white is clouds, and then in the red circle, it's a little bit hard to see, but there's these kind of tan lines, and that is dust coming off of what's called the Great Salt Lake Desert. It's an area west of the Great Salt Lake. During this event, we did also detect dust off of the Great Salt Lake shoreline itself. And so when we had this dust come in, the upper right graph is indicating the increase in PM10, which are particles in the atmosphere, and these increased in the atmosphere to levels that were hazardous for human health. So I think the level here is around 480 micrograms, whereas the health standard is 150. So if it goes above 150, that's bad for all of us, and we were well above that at 480. So definitely this is a health concern. We don't want to be breathing that. And then the bottom right picture, during this event, when the dust came in, it kind of mixed with the rain and snow and fell on people's cars and houses and created what we call muddy snow. And people then saw their cars the next day and were like, what happened? And so there was a bit of news attention for all of the kind of mud that came in this storm. Okay, so why are we concerned in terms of human health? So biggest thing about human health that we think about is the size of our particles. And so the good news is most dust is a little bit bigger, and so we call that PM10. And the image of the person on the left is PM10 particles. And what this is showing is how far into your respiratory system These bigger particles, PM10 particles, basically they will hit your nose, your mouth, your throat, and the upper part of your respiratory system. And so these will cause things like a cough, a sore throat, but they usually don't cause the more harmful chronic conditions. However, some dust is smaller. And these smaller particles we call fine particles, or PM2.5, and they can go deeper into the lungs. So going deeper into the lungs, they stay in your body longer and they cause more respiratory issues. Getting even smaller, which some of the dust is a little bit smaller, these really tiny particles, very fine particulates, PM1, and they can go all the way deep into your lungs to the alveoli, which are where we have oxygen and carbon dioxide being going from your bloodstream to your lungs. And so that's more a concern. And then there are these tiny ultrafine particles that actually are able to go from your lungs into your bloodstream and into the rest of your body. And luckily, most of the dust isn't that small. It doesn't go that far, but that is definitely a concern, thinking about those really tiny particles and how deep they might go. So the size really matters in terms of the impacts, but even those big particles cause symptoms and cause health concerns. The composition of the dust, there's less research about dust composition. So the composition might matter, that we were talking about arsenic, but really all the particles are harmful. So no matter what's in the dust, it's still harmful. And then we'll talk more in a moment about some of these other impacts on natural ecosystems and snow and water. Okay, so here we go. So what are some of the impacts of dust deposition on our more natural ecosystems? Let's go, on the upper left, affecting water chemistry. So as the dust falls on snow or on water bodies, it goes in there, it changes the chemistry of your water. Dust on snow, in the middle impact image here, makes the snow darker, and the snowpack actually melts earlier due to that darker snow surface. Dust adds nutrients, the upper right, it adds nutrients to mountain lakes, and it can lead to something called eutrophication, which is basically an overgrowth of algae and bacteria in a lake that uses up oxygen, and then that makes it so things like fish aren't able to live in the lake. It changes the development of soils in our mountain ecosystems. Some soils in our mountain ecosystems are almost entirely made up of dust, which changes that ecosystem. It changes local ecology because those dust particles can have living things on them, bacteria, fungi, and it can change what ends up in that ecosystem. And not so much here, but in places like the Amazon rainforest, it actually fertilizes the rainforest. It provides nutrients. So there's some positive effects of dust, but also some potential negatives. Okay, so what can be done? So what can we do about this project to reduce future impacts? So overall, biggest thing is increasing water flows to the Great Salt Lake. And that's a simple thing to say, a very hard thing to do. And I'm going to talk about some of the things that people are trying to do in just a moment. But increasing water flows to the Great Salt Lake, and also then managing the water. So managing where the water is going and when, because that can help to keep some vital ecosystems in place. So water management is a big part of that. For dust specifically, cleaning up the inflows of the lake to decrease potential pollutants that are in those soils. So making sure the water that does go in is clean and is not increasing heavy metals or other concerning things in the soils. Reducing disturbance. So we talked about that. We don't want to disturb those crusts. Keeping the crusts in place to not have more dust. So not having anyone drive on that and reducing any kind of disruptive types of recreation. So just walking on the lake bed can disturb some of those soils, but you don't do a big impact to a big area. But riding ATVs or vehicles or mining operations on those soils can have a much bigger impact. And then for mining and agriculture, you need using dust suppression for those things to reduce dust. So one of the problems is we have a feedback cycle. And so the dust being produced from the Great Salt Lake is actually helping to make the problem worse. So this is one of the challenges we're facing. We call this a wicked problem. And so as the lake level declines, we're producing dust. And this is a photo on the right from Solitude Ski Resort. This is, my mom took this past spring, and you see big areas of dust, and that makes the snow darker and makes the snow melt faster, and you get actually less snow melt, less water going to the lake. And so when we have less water to the lake, we have more dust and potentially an increasing feedback cycle. So a negative feedback, basically less water, more dust. So that's a concern, but there are things, there are some data on, well, how much more water do we need? So this is some data, the Great Salt Lake is on the left, about how much more water do we need? And so the blue is how much water is already going to the Great Salt Lake. So for Great Salt Lake, it's about 3.5 kilometers cubed per year of water. And so how much more water do we need to kind of stabilize the lake and keep it at, you know, good levels for our ecosystems? About 30% more, which is quite a bit of water, but not as bad as other places in Siberia and Iran. They're even in more of a difficult situation where they would almost need to double their amount of water. So we have kind of a target. How much water do we need? The tricky part is how do we get that water to the lake? So there is some work being done, and so this was an article from the Deseret News in March of this year, kind of reflecting back on the state legislative session. And so the title is, "It was the year of the Great Salt Lake for Utah lawmakers, but was it enough? Here's what the experts have to say." And so they went through this big list here. I won't go through all of these, but there's a big list here of bills that were passed during our legislative session that could potentially help the Great Salt Lake. And some of these are really, really important. Basically now says the Great Salt Lake is a beneficial use, and so we can put water rights toward the Great Salt Lake. There's also some things in here about conserving water, particularly what's called secondary water, which is water mainly used for irrigation in our landscapes. And there's also some things in here about helping farmers to conserve water and use less water. Previously, there was kind of a use it or lose it doctrine in Utah, whereas if the farmers didn't use their water, they lost that water right. Now they can be more efficient and kind of not lose a water right for being more efficient and using less water. So has been some progress made, but there's still concerns. And again, this is from the Great Salt Lake Advisory Council. I won't go through all of this, but there's still more that needs to be done. And so what are some things to do? Talking to your elected officials, make sure they understand that we're concerned about the Great Salt Lake, thinking about how we can use water more efficiently, both on an individual level, but also collectively as cities and counties, and making sure you're informed about this topic. And in a moment, I'm going to get a list of a whole bunch of ways to become more informed. So this is a huge list of stuff. If you want this list, you can send me an email. For those online, I have my email at the end of the presentation. If you're here in person, I brought my business card, so you can send me an email. But there are lots of organizations that care about the Great Salt Lake and are doing things actively to try to monitor the Great Salt Lake and protect it. And so there's some state organizations, Utah Division of Forestry, Fire, and State Lands, and the Great Salt Lake Advisory Council, and are kind of at the organization. So a new organization, the Great Salt Lake Collaborative, is a group of media organizations throughout the state who understand the Great Salt Lake is such an important issue that they're going to work together instead of kind of competing with each other to put really important information out there. And then some nonprofits like Friends of Great Salt Lake and Save Our Great Salt Lake. And so to kind of wrap up, if you have questions on this, I'm happy to answer questions now, but also feel free to get in touch with me. My email is up here, and again, if you're in person, I'm happy to give you a card. But bottom line is the Great Salt Lake is really at a critical point right now. If we continue the trend we're going to have kind of worsening problems and potentially a collapse of our Great Salt Lake ecosystem. But we're at the critical point right now that we really need to try to take actions to get more water to the lake to kind of halt some of those issues and then hopefully start to reverse them. So thank you very much for listening.
There's something you said that I sort of understood, but not exactly. It was that when the dust is on the snow, it's gonna melt faster because I understood that. And we want it to last throughout the dry season especially, but you also said it would cause less water to go to the lake, and that just didn't.
Yeah, absolutely. And I didn't go into detail. So why will dust on snow produce less water? So there's a couple reasons. One is when you melt the snow faster, basically you have a longer period of time with no snow on that landscape. And so when you do have precipitation falling on it, there's more water that has to go into the soil. So you lose water and runoff because more water is going into the soil. Also, another factor with the runoff coming, kind of melting faster is that the pulse kind of is shifted. And so basically there's less ability to store the water in kind of the natural aquifers because the aquifers are already full. So it's coming kind of as a big pulse instead of more spread out. And so our natural aquifers kind of underground aren't able to kind of store that and release it. And so there's less runoff later in the season that, would have been stored there. So those are kind of the biggest factors is kind of more bare soil, and that also leads to more evaporation because there's no snow cover to kind of protect those soils.
Thanks.
Yeah. Other questions from folks in here?
Just some things that we can do as individuals, like water, less water for grass.
Yeah.
Secondary water.
Right. Yes. So the number one, in terms of like individual use of water, the number one thing is your landscape. So grass, gardens, things like that. We definitely use a lot of water in other parts, but really the biggest chunk is outside watering. And so trying to be more efficient. So the Utah Division of Water Resources, they put out every week kind of a guide for how much you should be watering your grass. And so that's a good thing to follow to see throughout the summer, spring, summer, fall, how much do I really need to be watering to keep things green. And so being more efficient in watering your outside landscape, also thinking about changing over parts of your outside landscape that use less water. And so our kind of traditional grass uses a lot of water, but there's other alternatives, xeriscaping or low water landscaping that can use a lot less water. So I think outside is the biggest thing. And then of course there's ways you can be more efficient inside as well, but really outside. And secondary water, yeah, people are like, oh, I can just use as much as I want. But one of the bills that was passed was to try to meter second water so people know how much they're using. And that can be really helpful as well. So if you don't know how much you're using, it's hard to like save the water. Yeah.
I have a question about both candidates and people who are already legislators. Are you able to present this to our current legislators? And
congratulations from Utah. I actually forgot to approve the second.
Oh, that's fine.
And
That's
my
fine.
friend gave me a card, so thank you.
Yeah, so, to the question of like, are the legislators getting this information? So last, legislative session, or maybe just before it, there was I forgot exactly what it's called, the Great Salt Lake, Forum or something like that, organized by, the, Speaker of the House, and, I didn't present there, but some of my colleagues did present at that event. But definitely there's legislators out there who aren't informed about this. And so if you want more information to kind of give to your legislators, or you have recommendations of, places to reach out, I'm definitely happy to present to more folks. Were there any questions on?
Yes, a question online is, does wearing masks help prevent dust from entering lungs?
Great question. So, I'm gonna put this as a broader question. What are ways to protect yourself when we do have dust? So first, how do you know if there's dust? The Utah Division of Air Quality has a great website where you can go on and see what are the current air quality levels. It's air.utah.gov. And you can find out what are the air quality levels, or should I be concerned about the air today? They also have an app, the Utah Air app, that you can download. And so if the air is bad that day, if we have dust in the air, how can you protect yourself? And so one is avoiding being outside. So when there's a lot of dust in the air, spending more time indoors, definitely not exercising outdoors is something we want to do. So staying inside, keeping yourself protected. If you're able, having filters in your home, we have these standalone filters, or there's things masks do help somewhat, and so if you do have to spend time outside wearing a well-fitted N95 or KN95 type mask, and I say well-fitted because any gaps around the outside, the air will go in those gaps and is not filtered. And so they do help somewhat, but the really tiny particles, they do get filtered by the mask, but again, they tend to just go around it if it's not really well to your face. So masks, I definitely recommend if you do have to spend time outside when the air is more hazardous, if there's a dust storm, or also during the winter inversion. But even better is to reduce your time outside and try to be in a building that has good filtration.
You can use the filter on your main system in the house, HVAC.
Yeah.
Do you need these portable things that seem to be very popular? Or is having that filter in the main system the better?
So one of the issues with the filter in the main system is that depending on your system, you may not be able to use a filter that has the highest filtration, because really high filtration filters basically let less airflow in, and so it reduces the efficiency of your HVAC system. And so if you're wondering what works, HVAC technicians may be able to help you. But if you're not able to put in more like the really highest quality filter in your HVAC system, then those portable kind of individual room to room filters do help. The other time the room to room filters can be definitely helpful is if you're not running your HVAC system. So during like the shoulder seasons, you're maybe not running your air conditioning, or you're not running your heating yet, those room to room ones can be helpful. So definitely there's benefits to both of them. In my home, I use both, so I have both room air filters and in my HVAC system. I don't have, again, in my HVAC, I don't have that highest quality one because it would just make it so my system wouldn't run efficiently. Any other questions online?
You can go ahead and unmute yourself if you have one.
If not, we might kind of, oh yeah, go ahead.
Is having all the exposed in the lake gonna create more dust storms? Or are we talking just in general thing that blows dust?
Yeah, so like 20 years ago, we basically had no dust coming off of the Great Salt Lake because most of the shoreline was covered by water. And so now we're at the point where we have lots of exposed shoreline. But as I said, not all of that is producing dust. So we have more dust coming off the Great Salt Lake than we used to, but there definitely is the potential for more in the future. So what could create more in the future? Disturbing the crusts on that could produce more. And then if the lake level declines more, that exposes more shoreline, and that could definitely produce more dust as well. So there's already dust coming off the Great Salt Lake, but there's definitely a concern that we could have even more dust from the Great Salt Lake in the future. Yep.
I know, climate change is the main thing that's making our temperatures getting hotter and hotter and hotter and longer and longer. But does the fact that there's not as much water also contribute to the raised temperature?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So there's a few other impacts of like the lower lake that I didn't kind of talk about. So one is definitely temperature. So in the summertime, there's something called the Great Salt Lake Breeze, which is basically the water kind of helps to moderate temperatures. And so on a hot summer day, the cities will get pretty hot. Over the lake, it'll be a little bit cooler. And in the afternoons, that will cause a breeze of air to come from the lake over the cities and cools the air a little bit. With a smaller lake, you get less of this lake breeze effect. Another factor for the smaller lake that can be a concern is Great Salt Lake effect snow. And so Great Salt Lake effect snow accounts for about 10% or so of our snow in the mountains of the central Wasatch. So as the lake gets smaller, we're getting basically less lake effect snow due to that, which then is another feedback of reducing the water supply.
Becky, do we have any more questions online?
I don't see any. If I miss somebody, please speak up. Is there any questions online?
Well, thank you, everyone, for being here. Thank you, online, for joining us.
Yes, it's been very informative. Thank you. And online says thank you. Also, they learned a lot.
Thank you so much.